Russia has just unleashed one of its most devastating overnight attacks of the entire war. Hundreds of drones, dozens of missiles, at least 14 civilians dead, over 100 wounded, and people still trapped under rubble in Kyiv, Dnipro, and Kharkiv as we speak. What makes this attack even more damning is that President Zelensky publicly warned it was coming days ago, and it happened anyway. The question tonight isn't just about Russia's brutality, it's about whether the West's response to that brutality has been anywhere near sufficient to stop it. Joining me now are Elena Vasquez, our Europe and EU analyst, and Alex Park, our technology and science analyst. Elena, let me start with you. After 3 years of these attacks, after every condemnation and every carefully calibrated weapons package, is the Western response to Russia simply not working?
Thanks, Emma. And I'll be blunt. No, it hasn't been working. And the reason it hasn't been working is that Western leaders have spent 3 years treating Ukrainian survival as a negotiating chip rather than a strategic imperative. What happened last night is not a surprise. It's the predictable result of half measures. When you tell an aggressor exactly what weapons you won't provide, exactly which targets are off limits, exactly how far Ukraine cannot strike, you're not de-escalating. You're handing Putin a tactical manual. Douglas Murray has made this point repeatedly, and he's absolutely right. The West's pattern of delayed deliveries and perpetual hesitation has not shortened this war. It has prolonged it and made it bloodier. Olaf Scholz spent years eyesing over Taurus missiles while Ukrainian cities burned. Macron talks about European strategic autonomy and then underwhelms on delivery. And the result is 14 dead civilians this Tuesday morning, with rescuers still pulling bodies from rubble. The hard truth is that if Ukraine had been given everything it needed in February 2022, we might not be having this conversation.
But Elena, some would argue, and this is the counterpoint you'll hear from Washington and Berlin, that more weapons, fewer restrictions, deeper strikes into Russia, that's not de-escalation. That's a path to direct NATO-Russia confrontation. Isn't there a legitimate argument that the West has actually prevented escalation to something far worse? And Alex, what's your take on this?
Well, look, I think Elena's instinct is correct, but her conclusion skips over some genuinely difficult variables. Here's what I think gets missed in this conversation. The West's hesitation isn't purely spinelessness, it's also a rational calculation about escalation risk from a nuclear-armed state. That calculation may be wrong. I actually think it has been wrong, but you can't just dismiss it. What concerns me from a data and strategic standpoint is this. Russia's defense budget is now running at approximately 40% of total federal expenditure. That is a full wartime economy. Meanwhile, Germany only crossed the NATO 2% GDP threshold in 2024, 30 years after the Cold War ended. The structural problem here isn't just this week's attack. It's that Europe built its security architecture on the assumption that peace was self-sustaining. And the bill for that assumption is being paid right now in Ukrainian apartment buildings. I'd also push back slightly on the framing that more weapons automatically equals faster resolution, because the foreign affairs analysis suggesting a ceasefire is now realistic, reflects something real about where the battlefield has stabilized.
I hear what Alex is saying, but with respect, the nuclear escalation argument has been used to justify every delay, every restriction, every half measure for 3 years, and Russia hasn't escalated to nuclear use. Not once. Putin uses that threat precisely because the West keeps flinching at it. That's not strategic caution. That's being played. Look, 14 people died last night, in their homes, after Zelensky warned this was coming. If that doesn't cut through the diplomatic hedging, what does? The ceasefire conversation makes me genuinely nervous because what Foreign Affairs is describing as Ukraine turning the tide looks a lot more like managed surrender to me. A frozen conflict where Russia keeps what it took is not a ceasefire. It's a pause before the next war.
Here's what I want to know, because this is the question that keeps coming up in diplomatic circles and in conservative foreign policy analysis. Is a ceasefire along current lines actually the worst outcome? Or is continued fighting at this scale even worse? Where do you see this going, Alex, in terms of realistic trajectories over the next year?
The way I see this playing out, there are really 3 forks in the road. The most probable near-term scenario, especially given the Trump administration's deal-focused approach to foreign policy, is a negotiated ceasefire along something close to current front lines. Foreign Affairs has explicitly called this realistic. The risk isn't that a ceasefire happens. The risk is that it happens on terms that reward Russian aggression and signal to Beijing and others that revisionism works if you're patient and brutal enough. The second trajectory is continued escalation, not by Western design, but by events on the ground outpacing diplomatic timelines. The American conservatives' framing of linked escalation between Ukraine and Iran is worth taking seriously. Washington managing two deteriorating crises simultaneously creates real coherence risks. And the third trajectory, the one I'd argue is strategically sounder, is sustained Ukrainian military capability that makes any Russian-held territory permanently costly, which actually strengthens ceasefire negotiating leverage rather than undermining it.
Here's what concerns me most, and I think this is the scenario that doesn't get enough attention. A ceasefire that freezes this conflict becomes the Korean model. A divided country, a permanent Russian military presence on European soil, and a clock ticking until Putin decides the moment is right to restart it. What history tells us about frozen conflicts is that they don't stay frozen forever. They stay frozen until the aggressor recalculates. And if the West signals now that this is the acceptable outcome, we're not ending this war. We're scheduling the next one. The uncomfortable truth is that 14 civilians dying in a single night 3 years into this conflict means the current approach has already failed. Adjusting that approach isn't escalation, it's strategy.
Elena Vasquez, Alex Park, a genuinely important and sobering conversation. 14 people are dead this morning. The rescuers are still in the rubble, and somewhere in a Kremlin briefing room, someone is looking at the West's response and deciding exactly how much further they can push. That calculus is the most dangerous variable in this entire war.